Hello and welcome to video number 8 in my series of videos for AQA psychology. This is biopsychology and the video is for syllabus 7181 and 7182 psychology. And this video is about the structure and function of sensory, relay and motor neurons. So what is a neuron? What is a nerve cell? And what's the difference between a sensory, a motor and a relay nerve cell? Well, it's all about taking information from one part of the body to another, and it's about where that information starts from and where it ends up. So let's start with a basic neuron. Like any cell in the body, it has a nucleus. All cells have nuclei, and nerve cells are no different. And the nucleus contains the DNA, it contains the chromosome pairs that make up the genetic code of the body. And remember, the genetic code is the same in every cell. The nucleus is in the cell body of the nerve cell, also sometimes called the soma. And the soma contains the nucleus and a lot of other organelles of the nerve cell which we don't really need to know about for biopsychology. In this nerve cell that we're looking at here, the dendrites are connected to the soma, but that's not always the case. So what are the dendrites? Well, the dendrites collect information and feed it into the nerve cell. Usually they connect information from synapses with other nerve cells, and more about the synapse in the next video, number 9. Because that's what a nerve cell is. It transmits information from one part of the body to another, and the dendrites are about collecting the information and feeding it along the nerve cell and onto somewhere else. Remember the analogy of the plane flying on autopilot that we looked at in video 7. Well, the nerve cells are like the wires in the autopilot, and the dendrites of this nerve cell are wires that collect information and feed it into this particular nerve cell. Axons. Axons transmit information from the dendrites to another part of the central nervous system or the body. Axons are sometimes, especially the ones used to control voluntary motion, axons are very often coated in a kind of insulation called a myelin sheath. That's a fatty layer of insulation which basically just speeds up transmission. The gaps between the myelin sheaths are called the nodes of Ranvier. Now, in every nerve cell in the body, nervous impulses only ever flow in one direction. They flow from the dendrites to the axons and never in reverse. And you can get nervous impulses to flow the wrong way in the laboratory, but that would never happen in real life. Axons can be very, very long. The longest axon in the human body is the sciatic nerve, which runs from the base of the spine all the way down to the big toe. So if I waggle my big toe, myelinated central nervous system, nerve cells in my motor cortex are transmitting impulses down through my brainstem, down my spine and into the sciatic nerve, which then collects that information from its dendrites and sends nervous impulses down the dendrites, down the axon, all the way down my leg and into the big toe, which makes my big toe waggle. And that is, of course, an efferent nervous pathway. And correspondingly, there is the other way of the dual carriageway. If I stub my big toe, then the pain sensation is transmitted up my leg via a different axon running in the other direction and into my spinal cord and to my brain. Axons are very, very small. There are about 1 micrometer in diameter, 1/1,000,000th of a metre. Much narrower than a human hair, and they're close to the smallest thing that you could actually possibly theoretically see with an ordinary optical microscope. In order to see an axon with the naked eye, you'd need to put 100 of them side to side just to even see it. So what are these nervous impulses that run down axons? These are electrochemical pulses called action potentials. And every second, a certain number of action potentials travel down the axon. An action potential is an all or nothing thing, and it's a question of how many of them happen per second. How many action potentials travel down the axon per second is called the firing rate of that nerve cell. And that can be up to about 200 hertz. That's 200 action potentials per second. And that can speed up and speed down. Axon terminals. Axons are like one long, thin wire. But at the end, they sometimes branch out. And at the end of every axon, or every branch of the axon, there is an axon terminal, or sometimes called a terminal button. And these are literally our nerve endings. It's where the action potentials end up. And these terminal buttons very often make a synapse with the dendrite of another nerve cell. And a synapse is a junction between nerve cells. So at the synapse, information gets transmitted from the axon of one nerve cell to the dendrite of another nerve cell. And in this way, information is transmitted from nerve cell to nerve cell to nerve cell. Okay, in a moment we're going to be looking at the difference between sensory neurons, motor neurons and relay neurons, but first it's time for this week's random psychology fact.
This week's random psychology fact is people who play video games are more likely to lucid dream compared to non-gamers. This is because in the dream world they control themselves like they're controlling a game character.
That was this week's random psychology fact. Okay, sensory neurons. Sensory neurons collect information from the outside world and transmit it into the central nervous system. They are part of an afferent pathway. Sensory neurons, their dendrites, don't connect with other nerve cells. They connect with specialised receptor cells in the senses which collect information from the outside world. For example, the specialised photosensitive receptor cells in the retina of the eye collect light from the outside world and transmit nervous impulses into the sensory neurons in the optic nerve, or the receptor cells in the skin collect information about pressure and transmit that information into sensory neurons which travel up our arms and into the central nervous system, or the specialised receptor cells in the cochlea of our ear detect vibrations in the air and transmit these into nervous impulses in sensory neurons which travel into our brain. Incidentally, the dendrites of a nerve cell, not just a sensory nerve cell, but any nerve cell, are sometimes called the dendritic tree. And that's because they look a bit like a tree under a microscope. Dendron is Greek and it means tree, like the branches of a tree in winter. Motor neurons, on the other hand, are efferent nerve cells. They take information, commands, from the motor cortex of the brain out through the central nervous system and to the skeletal muscles, and they control our motor motions, our movements of our body. These axons don't synapse onto the dendrites of other nerve cells. They make a specialised connection with something called a motor end plate on a muscle fibre. And when a motor neuron increases its firing rate, that means that the muscle fibre to which it is attached will contract. And if a motor neuron lowers its firing rate, it means that the muscle fibre to which it's attached will relax. The motor neurons connect onto skeletal muscles, and the skeletal muscles are, as you would imagine, the muscles that are connected to our skeleton, and they control our motion. Okay, so the final kind of nerve cell that we need to look at is a relay neuron. Sensory neurons and motor neurons are all about the CNS, central nervous system, communicating with the outside world. Sensory nerve cells are afferent pathways bringing information in, and motor neurons are efferent pathways controlling our muscles, taking information out. Relay neurons are completely internal to the central nervous system. They simply connect one neuron to another. The dendrites synapse onto the axon end plates of one nerve cell, and the axons of the relay neuron synapse onto the dendrites of a different nerve cell. And so relay nerve cells form the network of nerve cells inside the central nervous system, which helps us to process information. Now, there's one particular type of relay nerve cell that we need to look at, and that is the kind that is used in a spinal reflex. Consider the case, supposing I put my hand into a flame and I get a sensation of pain in my fingers. Well, that pain will travel up the afferent sensory nerve into my spine, and there that sensory neuron synapses onto a relay neuron. That relay neuron transfers the nervous impulse from my sensory nerve cell onto a motor nerve cell. And that motor nerve cell runs back down the arm, and it makes the muscle contract, which withdraws my hand from the source of pain. So a reflex arc of this kind is a spinal reflex which provides an automatic mechanism so that the hand can be withdrawn from a harmful stimulus really, really quickly. And the reason that that processing takes place in the spine is because if the nerve impulse had to go into the spinal cord, then all the way up to the brain and all the way back down again, then that would take up time. And having a spinal reflex where the action is controlled by a reflex which takes place via a relay neuron in the spine just makes it a lot quicker and saves the fingers from getting burned. So this has been video number 8, and it has been about the structure and function of sensory, motor and relay neurons.